Hi, everyone. My name is Kurt Roney. I'm professor of strategic management here at the Tillman School of Business at the University of Mount Olive. And the purpose of this video is to briefly review the first chapter in the textbook that we'll be using for in our course Business 410 on strategic management. And the textbook we're using, I hope you can see this, is by John Parnell, entitled Strategic Management Theory and Practice. So we're going to be going over Chapter 1, and we later on will go over every one of the 12 chapters in this textbook in a little video recording, sometimes not so little, so that those of you who are unable to attend class or who attend class through an online medium will be able to run through the basic concepts of the chapters with me, and so that I'll be able to point out perhaps some of the more important items in those chapters to help you with your review. So with that, I think the best thing to do is to get the PowerPoint slides from this textbook on the screen, and we can begin that review. One suggestion before I start is that you print off the PowerPoint slides that are on your Moodle shell so that you can follow along with me and make notes. You know, you can make, I think, 6 slides per page, so it won't take that much paper or printer ink. But if you do that, it'll certainly help you get ready for quizzes and tests. And as you go through the casework in this course, you know, we usually form teams of students to study particular companies that are chosen at the beginning of the course. And so if you print off the PowerPoint slides and make notes, that should enable you more easily to do the assessments, the strategic assessments of the companies that you have chosen. So with that, let's see if we can get going. Now, I confess that this is a new version of Zoom. I've been using Zoom now for, I think, 3 years. It's a wonderful system, but this one's changed a bit, and so I'm going to be a little bit clumsy as I try to use its various features. All right, well, that worked out okay anyway, so I guess we're off to a good start. And I think the next thing I'll do is make these slides fill the screen so that you can see them better. There we go. Chapter 1 is very similar to the introductory chapters that you'll find in lots of textbooks. Its purpose is pretty much to lay out some basic concepts that are real important, and also to identify the scope and sequence of chapters to follow, essentially to let you know what this textbook includes. And there are 12 chapters in the textbook, so in a moment we'll see a slide that just summarizes what's there. The key issues that are in this Chapter 1 involve the definitions of strategy and strategic management, an interesting concept that deals with the real world, what we intend as strategy and what turns out to actually happen. what some of the more important forces that are influencing how we form strategy and make strategic plans today. The role of corporate governance, very important. The nature of strategic decisions, and finally, a brief mention of the fact that today corporate decision making and strategy formation require us to see an industry globally, whether that's because we purchase raw materials from around the world or try to sell our products around the world or services. So this is that summary that I mentioned of the chapters in this textbook. Pardon me, I'll be drinking now and then to keep my throat moist. I've been doing a lot of talking today and my throat's a little hoarse. But very important right off the bat is the notion that there are external forces that we need to deal with and plan for. And so John Parnell, the author, starts out right away dealing with those concepts. And if you've been in my first lecture introducing you to the scope of strategic management, you know that there's an essential fit that has to be accomplished between our internal capabilities, resources, and the skills and capabilities to make use of resources, and the external environment where we have to deploy and employ those resources. We can't control the external environment, can't control the economy, markets, or industry structure, at least not very much. But we certainly can control the resources that we have to work with within our own company. And our challenge, of course, is to mold those internal capabilities so that they fit that external environment that we're trying to do business in to get the maximum productivity, the maximum performance potential. So chapters 2 through 5 deal with those, with what we have to deal with, the external environment and internal resources. And in chapter 5 is it's good that it's there, but in lecture 1 and also in the next lecture, lecture 2, I'll be dealing a lot more with the resources that we, and the way we need to look at resources and assess them in order to prepare good strategic plans. In any event, the textbook will move on then to take us through the process of making that fit and forming strategy. And if you've been with me in lecture 1 already, you remember that my definition of strategy is all the work and concept that management intends to achieve its goals and its rationale for selecting the approach to be taken rather than alternatives. That's a little bit more comprehensive than the definition you will find in this textbook. But you'll also find that John and I have very similar thoughts. Our wording is a little bit different, but you won't find any major conflicts. With one exception, which we'll get into later in this review when we get into something called contingency theory. And there I'm going to provide a little bit of a correction to a little mistake that I think that Professor Parnell has made. In any event, after talking about strategy for 4 chapters, right? 6, 7, 8, and 9. Parnell talks about implementation of strategy. And finally, in a concluding chapter, a very interesting discussion of control and crisis management, which I think you'll find to be an interesting way to kind of wrap up the course. So this gets us to start off talking about some basic concepts in strategic management. And again, if you've been with me in lecture 1, which you well may have, you know that my definition of mission is a little different than this one. I've told you that mission is the economic function that a firm undertakes to perform for society. It's like a social contract. And but you can see that we're not too different here. Broadly defined, enduring statement of purpose identifies the scope of operations and what the firm offers to stakeholders. And of course, those stakeholders are society and the different groups within society. So strategy then, according to the textbook, refers to top management's plans to gain competitive advantage so that the firm can fulfill its mission. And I gave you a somewhat broader definition of strategy, all the work that management intends to achieve its goals and its rationale for selecting the approach to be taken rather than alternatives. But the management's plans and Parnell's words are consistent with all the work and concept, sustaining competitive advantage. Of course, that's one of the primary objectives that we try to accomplish when we form strategy. So John then moves into the nature of competitive advantage, where the firm's strategies are so good because the strategy has identified and made use of resources that are valuable, difficult to imitate, difficult to duplicate, that they set the firm apart from other firms in the industry that would do the same, try to perform the same mission, and give it thereby an advantage, an ability to generate value for its shareholders and its stakeholders to a greater extent than other firms who try to perform the same mission. And so by accumulating resources that are so unique, so valuable, so difficult to imitate, the firm gains sustained competitive advantage. We want competitive advantage, but just outperforming our rivals in the short term isn't enough. Sometimes we can do that just by cutting costs. The problem is that when you do that, you don't build resources to continue in the mission. So what we're looking for is the ability to do a superior job of pursuing a mission over a long term. And in order to do that, we need sustained competitive advantage. It's an important concept. Strategic management, in Parnell's terms, is a broader. It's a broader concept. It's a broader term, just than strategy, because strategic management is a process that involves all those things that we just talked about. And this slide talks mainly about including the external environment in that process. That's very important because management does not have control over the economy, market, or industry structure. And therefore, management has to be constantly aware of how that external environment is changing in order to mold its internal resources to fit that external environment. And of course, that's changing all the time. So as the environment changes, strategy needs to change too. But I would have liked Parnell to modify this slide so that he includes the internal resources as well as the external environment. A couple of important concepts that are taken from economics. The efficient market hypothesis, Parnell summarizes, and it's the idea that over time, firms that survive competition as an industry grows from its outset, from its very beginnings to maturity. You know, a lot of firms may make an attempt to get into the industry. Not all will succeed. Those that do, those that remain in the industry, will over time develop the same sets of resources, the same sets of skills. And according to the efficient market hypothesis, the market is efficient. It separates out, kind of like Darwin, you know, survival of the fittest. Only those that do things the right way and the same way, according to this theory, are the ones that are going to survive over time. And because of the fact that they do it the same way, there isn't a great deal of difference in their performance, whether it's the quality of their products or their financial results. Then we get into the other side of the story, the so-called subjective value. And that's the notion that in your hands and my hands, the same set of resources will have different values. That in one firm that has a certain collection of resources, if it adds another resource, that resource will be able to be blended with and become part of a bundle of resources that's unique to that firm. In another company, there may not be either the ability to make use of those same identical resources, or they may bundle up in a different way with a different set of dissimilar resources, so that no one firm really is the same. And for that reason, you know, even though firms can have similar resources, they don't have similar capabilities. And it's that dissimilarity of capabilities that creates the opportunity for competitive advantage. This takes us to the idea of a business model. Parnell just basically introduces us to it. I would have liked to see Parnell just get into this a little more in detail. But a business model explains how a firm accumulates its inputs by purchasing raw materials, labor, gaining capital, and so forth, but gains its inputs, processes them, and creates outputs that are delivered to customers. How all that happens deliberately, how the firm makes it happen, is the firm's business model. Different firms in the same industry often have similar business models, but not exactly the same business models. And so once again, you get firm heterogeneity. But in this case, the heterogeneity is the result of management decisions. And so, as Parnell points out, progressive, and I would add successful firms often devise innovative business models that extract revenue and profits from sources that their competitors haven't identified. Okay, so what then are the characteristics of firms that that form strategy successfully. First of all, as we've already pointed out, management needs to really understand what's going on in that external environment because it can't be controlled, but it can be understood. We have to not only understand it, we have to form some idea, as the very fifth point on this slide mentions. We have to understand what the possible changes in the external environment and our competitive environment generally are going to entail. And it may not be just a change in the economy or the market or even the industry structure, but changes in technology. So there's a lot that goes into choosing strategy and how we form our internal capabilities to fit that external environment most effectively. But one thing is for sure, and that is that the external environment is going to keep changing. So our strategy is going to have to keep changing too. The second point that Parnell points out is that the strengths and weaknesses in firms' capabilities must be assessed realistically. And ideally, as strategy is implemented, those capabilities are going to get better. And as they change, and as the external environment changes, fitting those two together is going to cause us to evolve strategy. So in addition to doing that is evolving strategy, Parnell reminds us that before we start forming strategy, we need to have a good grasp of what the mission of our firm is. That is, what is that economic function that is going to be performed for society, why it is that we're going to be able to satisfy an unmet need with distinctive competence. And then specifically what that means for us in terms of our firm's sales, financial results, operating results and performance, and so forth. What are the intended results that we're pursuing? And then we can form a strategy that is aimed at achieving those results. And finally, Parnell points out that before we go, we think we're done, it's really important to develop implementation methods and procedures before we launch. Very often companies will develop goals and strategy. They'll be very aspirational, but they won't be realistic in defining exactly what has to be done to make that strategy come true. And so Parnell is reminding us here that that's critical. And I agree completely. Okay, this takes us to a notion that was provided to us by a guy named Henry Mintzberg that Parnell summarizes, and it's the difference between intended strategy and realized strategy. So we form this strategy and our strategic plans to implement. And then what happens? The world changes out there. So although our strategic plan is appropriate for the environment that we assumed would exist when we wrote the plan, lo and behold, the economy and the market and perhaps the industry itself didn't behave the way we thought it would. And consequently, we may be implementing a plan for a world that does not exist. How can we deal with that? And the answer is way back there, that fifth point again. We need to be aware of alternative futures. And because we have the technology with computer modeling systems, and a whole lot of other information technology, we can actually do that. Back in the old days when I was doing strategic planning in companies that didn't even have computers or had great big mainframe computers but didn't have online real-time computing, we did a bunch of number crunching, and we were glad that we could get that done in time to form the plan. However, we just didn't have the ability to modify, to be as flexible as we can today with the abundance of cloud computing, online real-time computing, and all the modeling capabilities that we have to imagine what the impact of a change in the economy, market, or industry will have on the feasibility of our strategy and our firm's performance potential. And so now we do what's called contingency planning. Not only do we form the prevailing plan, but we prepare in less detail conceptual plans for how we would respond if the world out there doesn't cooperate with us and goes away different from what our best guess is about the way the external world will unfold over the planning period. So what can happen in the real world is that managers in the field, managers in the factory, they find out that there's a change in the availability of raw materials or the technology to make our products with, or the demand for our products or our competitors and so forth. As a result, they change on the spot. They'll change the strategy. They'll do something different because it makes the most sense to do it a different way. Now, if the firm is well enough organized, that information will get up to top management. And top management, if it's mature enough, if it can get over the fact that it can't always be right, it'll say, oh, damn, things are different now. Our intended strategy isn't going to work. We're going to have to change it. And so they do. They change their strategy. Life goes on. Now, as somebody who has done strategic planning in several firms, as a consultant as well as an officer of corporations, you're caught between two extremes here. On the one hand, if you're not flexible, if you don't make the change in strategy, as important changes in that external environment are discovered, you could end up going down the wrong road. On the other hand, if things can change so rapidly that if you're changing your strategy every day, you have chaos and nothing gets done and everybody gets confused. So it's very important to try to identify which of the changes in that external environment are so important that you have to adapt strategy to them. And recognize that in other cases, you've got to stay the course. And even though there might be a little rough sledding, you can get through it better than if you tried to shake things up all the time. Very difficult to achieve a balance between intended and realized strategy. I don't think Mintzberg ever came to grips with that. And the reason I don't is that, to my knowledge, although he's met lots of managers, I don't think he's actually managed things himself. And academics can add a great deal to what we know about strategy, but they very often lose or lack that understanding of how things happen in the real world. I think that this trade-off between an important change in the external environment that causes realized strategy, that causes a need to alter realized strategy, to make realized strategy the intended strategy by altering strategy. The difference between that and not changing strategy and staying the course, even though if you were doing the plan all over again, you might have done it a little differently. There's a trade-off there, and I think that academics very often just don't appreciate that. Okay, this takes us to another concept that Parnell wants to share with us. And it's the difference between strategy as art and strategy as science. And he starts out by pointing out that strategic management and strategic planning provide an opportunity for managers to be smart, innovative, creative. Some companies are blessed by brilliant managers and chief executives who change their company and sometimes change the world. Maybe Apple was an example. And so Parnell points out that strategies can be formed, kind of like the picture in this slide, as you make something out of clay, rather than by a formula, by doing something by the numbers very specifically in a scientific fashion. But then he points out the fact that indeed we are learning a lot more about what works in strategic management through research. We do research and we find out that some methods work better than others in various circumstances. In some circumstances, you ought to do planning one way, in other circumstances are not. And this, by the way, gets us into the notion of contingency theory. And this is a little topic where Parnell does not quite give us a definition that satisfies me. And we'll get into it in just a couple minutes. But basically, we are learning through research that you can't do strategic planning in a company that has long-lived assets, a great big asset-intensive manufacturing enterprise, as opposed to a very fast-paced consumer products company, for example. Would you really do strategic planning the same way in a big bank as you would in a company that is developing chemicals? And I'll make another remark about this when we get to the point of contingency theory. But we now know that just the same way that the doctor, when you go to the doctor, you say, "Doctor, I don't feel so well today." Doctor doesn't say, "Well, take a couple aspirin and call me in the morning." The doctor, listens to your heart, maybe takes a blood sample, does a diagnosis and says, "Oh, okay, you've got the flu," or whatever, and then begins to provide treatment. The same thing is true in strategic management. Over time, we are developing technology for doing the work of strategic planning, and through research, we're also learning what methods of strategic planning work best in what circumstances. And so today, as Parnell concludes in this slide, the scientific approach is prominent in this textbook, and as he says previously, it's the more prominent approach to strategic management today. Yes, there is innovation. Yes, there is creativity, and when it happens, it can change everything. But very often, good strategic planning, like any other discipline, just requires plain hard work and diligence. And that's the part that people don't like to talk about as much, the hard work. Okay, so Parnell takes us to 3 economic concepts that underlie strategic management. One is industrial organization theory, as he points out, a branch of microeconomics, and it's based upon the influence of that external environment, and particularly the industry, which is made up of the firm and its competitors and firms that are related to it. And they're sort of locked in place at any given time. So at any given time, the firm's strategy, that is its arrangement of resources and the capabilities that it employs to use those resources, and its methods and its procedures, okay? There could be one selection of those things that best fits that industry's organization. So if you can figure out what that is, that'll enable you to form a very effective strategy. And we're going to hear a lot about one strategist's approach to forming strategy in response to industrial organization. And you've probably heard his name. It's Michael Porter. Porter developed a view of strategic management, which is still very influential today, based upon industrial organization theory. Porter was trained as an economist at Penn State University. No surprise that although what was surprising was his productivity. Porter has probably been the most influential architect of strategic management methodology. Nevertheless, something has come along after Porter that is now at least as influential as Porter's models. I say after Porter, but it was really, the approach was developed before Porter came along by a lady named Edith Penrose in England, but championed later by a professor at Northwestern University, Birger Warnerfeld. And I sat at an Academy of Management meeting in Cincinnati one year when Warnerfeld and some others came together to sort of announce the resource-based view of competitive advantage. Warnerfeld was not only articulate, he was funny as he could be, and just absolutely made a great presentation, which was followed by some other greats of strategic management and resource-based view, particularly Jay Barney and a guy named Joe Mahoney. These folks just, in that one meeting, and another important lady named Kathy Eisenhart, and together they just pushed the resource-based view of competitive advantage into the forefront. Warnerfeld published a little article in Strategic Management Journal that really just bolted it in place, and that was followed by a series of articles and a stream of literature by those others, as well as additional people, Margaret Petteraff, oh my, I'm forgetting another one, and she'll be angry at me because I've forgot her name. Shame on me. But in any event, Dirks is her last name. Anyway, the resource-based view holds that it's a firm's capabilities, its resources, physical and intellectual, that gives it distinctive competence. The Industrial organization view is fine as long as the industry is organized in a particular way. But as we know, economies, markets, and industries are much more dynamic today than they ever were, and they're going to be more tomorrow than they are today. Consequently, the strategy that you form to deal with an industry today may be inappropriate 6 months from today. If you've got the resources, and particularly the dynamic capabilities that come from the ability to manage resources dynamically, then as that external environment changes, so can the firm's capabilities to maintain that fit and or innovate. And so over time, the folks who form strategic management theory and methodology have become much more impressed by the resource-based view because it seems to cover a lot more in the way of contingencies. And this takes us then to contingency theory. Parnell says contingency theory is a middle ground. It's sort of a combination of industrial organization and resource-based view of competitive advantage. And in fact, there were a couple of guys who wrote about the contingency theory before this most recent literature on the resource-based view came out. Dan Schendel at Purdue and Hoffer, and I cannot remember Hoffer's first name, shame on me, but Hoffer wrote an article in the Strategic Management Journal that it basically started the contingency theory on the road. And basically it's what I said earlier. It's not about strategy per se, but how strategy is formed. So the way we do strategic planning and strategic management in a heavy manufacturing industry is different from the way we'll do it in a fast-paced consumer industry, by way of example. Just imagine that in the asset-intensive manufacturing industry, a strategic decision is made to launch a new product line with a new manufacturing facility that's going to cost $10 billion, big number, very expensive, a lot of resources put into it, going to be implemented over a significant time. This is going to be a big deal, all right? And before the chief executive and top management launches a strategy like that, you better believe that the board of directors is going to have to understand it, know it, adopt it, approve it, and especially approve the commitment of funds that will be required to implement that strategy. Thus, the board of directors better be involved with top management in forming strategy. Now, let's take the situation of a fast-paced consumer industry, ladies' fashions. Whereas in some manufacturing industries, 10 years, long-range planning or strategic planning might require the planning period to be 10 years. In ladies' fashions, 1 year is long-range planning. And in some consumer industries, 2 or 3 years could be long-range planning. And in those industries, things happen very fast. So if we were to develop the same approach to forming strategic plans and implementing them and involving the board of directors in those decisions and approvals, then by the time the plan got approved, it would be out of date. No doubt about it. The way we do strategic planning in a fast-paced consumer industry is different than the way we do it in an asset-intensive industry. And it's different in the financial industry and the high technology industry and so forth. So different industries require different ways of making strategic plans and strategic decisions. And that's the contingency theory, that the same approach does not fit all situations. You've got to adopt your strategic decision-making and planning method to the requirements of the industry and other related environmental circumstances in the economy and market. So contingency theory, Parnell says it views organizational performance as the joint outcome of what's going on outside the firm and the firm's strategic actions or its internal capabilities. And we're in the same ballpark here. We've got the same idea. The difference is that the way it was originally written, contingency theory, was all about how those strategic decisions are made to suit the circumstances of the industry. Okay, so we don't have to go over too much more in this diagram because I've pretty well beat it to death. The one thing that we can probably look at briefly is the right-hand column, where Parnell simply reminds us that if you're going to do a project to form a strategic plan or do a strategic management project in this course, for instance, or in real life, then the industrial organization theory will compel us to do a very thorough assessment of what's going on in the industry, and I would add the economy and the market as well. Resource-based theory compels us to really get on top of our capabilities. As the strengths and weaknesses is okay, but that phrase, strengths and weaknesses, really doesn't get at understanding the nature of our resources and capabilities. We could have strong resources and capabilities that are irrelevant to the strategic challenge. And we could have weaknesses that if we don't fix them up, we're not going to be able to meet that challenge. So strengths and weaknesses is just a little too broad term for me. Contingency theory, using Parnell's interpretation, says, well, then what we have to do is find a way to reconcile the strengths and weaknesses in our capabilities to opportunities and threats in the external environment. Yes, indeed, with some provisions. Let me give you an example. Here we are at Apple. Steve Jobs is still the chairman, the CEO. And into his office walk some product engineers. And they say, hey, look, and some marketing, I don't know, just some managers. And they say, what we need is to have mobile music. We're in the computer business now, but what we need is mobile music, the same way the Sony Walkman used to provide mobile music, but people don't go jogging with little discs on their hip anymore. So we think that we ought to be looking at mobile music. So Jobs leans back in his chair, we'll make believe, and says to his strategic planner, well, what do you think? How do we approach this? And the planner says, well, what are our strengths and weaknesses? Let's do a SWOT analysis. What are our strengths and weaknesses to do mobile music? And the engineers beats the hell out of us. We never did it before. We don't have any mobile music. So we don't have any strengths and weaknesses. And so Jobs sort of grimaces a little bit, and says, well, what are the opportunities and threats out there? And then the marketing people say, well, it ought to be pretty good, but frankly, we don't know for sure because nobody else is doing this, and no, there is not any mobile music device out there, so we don't know what the opportunity is, or for that matter, what the downside is, the threat. And so Jobs just throws up his hands and says, "Oh, the hell with it, let's go on to something else." And if that's the way, if Apple had used SWOT analysis, you and I wouldn't have had the iPod and iTunes in the iStore. But we do, or did. Pretty well moved through it. And the rest was history. And so, Jobs did not use SWOT analysis because SWOT locks you into your current business and it puts a box around it. And it's very difficult to get outside the box and to go into new areas, such as the kind of technology that involved the cloud and what became iPod and the iStore, iTunes. So SWOT can have the effect of putting limits on your thinking. And when that happens, it can put a constraint on strategy. And that's why we need to be very careful. Obviously, if you're in a mature industry where a lot is known and not a lot is changing, SWOT is just fine. Okay. This takes us to corporate governance, which we talked about a little bit before when we were talking about mission. Parnell makes a distinction between how strategic decisions are made by small business owners that are privately held, as opposed to management of larger corporations where there are more stakeholders. Stakeholders, that term isn't used here. We'll hear about it in the future in this course. But we do see on this slide and read in this part of the chapter about pension and retirement funds, mutual funds, banks, and of course, there are other stakeholders. Aside from customers, there are employees and society itself, even government. And so the stakeholders will have a lot to say or a lot of influence regarding exactly how corporate governance unfolds, how it actually takes place, and how the directors make decisions in response to the influence and desires and needs of all these stakeholders, some of which may be big block holders, as the term is used here, who have a lot of grease. They own a lot of stock. Okay, so here we are looking at the boards of directors who are making these decisions. They are supposed to be representatives of the shareholders. They're responsible for taking part very often in strategic planning, but don't forget that in some industries, fast-paced industries, if they get too involved in strategic planning, what will happen? The firm will move so slow that it'll be eclipsed by its competition. So it's in those big asset-intensive corporations that the board can play a part in strategic planning and must do so because of the capital commitments that are required. On the other hand, if you're in a very fast-paced, especially asset-light service organization, or as I said, a ladies' fashion company, things happen so quickly that the chief executive and management has to be able to make decisions on the fly. Then it must communicate with the board very fluidly so that the board can be in a constant state of information, a review, and evaluation, and thereby provide broad direction, either because, as point number 2 suggests, they're involved in strategic planning or they're able to do a very fluid review and assessment function. And finally, boards are responsible for selecting the chief executive and determining his or her compensation. Okay, there is a problem that can arise in boards of directors, and that is when the chief executive is also the chairman of the board, and yet it happens so much. During the time that I was a planning officer, a planning manager, a planning consultant, more companies that I worked with had CEO duality, where the chief executive was the chairman and vice versa. And that simply creates conflicts, and that can make for real problems. And in fact, there were a number of real problems where CEO conflicts of interest created what's the word I'm looking for? Scandals. And the result was a response by the government, the US government anyway, to pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, which put a lot of constraints on what top management can do. For instance, it required the CFO and the CEO both to sign financial and other public statements. The audit committee that reviews financial statements cannot have a member of corporate management. The corporation no longer can extend personal loans to executives or board members. As a result of Sarbanes-Oxley and the response to these scandals that I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there are fewer companies today where the chief executive is also the chairman of the board. It's still an issue. You can see that the effectiveness of Sarbanes-Oxley is widely debated according to this slide. But frankly, I would anticipate even more oversight by public agencies, particularly in Europe and the United States. We can see more legislation like this, not less. Okay, so what are these decisions then what are characteristics of decisions that turn out well? First of all, it's done in a systematic way where the analysis of internal capabilities and the external environment, as I said earlier, when you start, internal capabilities are probably not well aligned to what's going on outside in the economy, market, and industry. So you've got to do a real thorough analysis. And a company that can do a thorough analysis of those two dimensions has a competitive advantage because it's going to have insight that other firms won't have. Second, many of the decisions that are made regarding strategy have extended consequences. The example that I gave earlier of deciding to come up with a new product line and build a very expensive manufacturing facility to do that, that is not as uncommon as you might think. Those kinds of decisions are made very often. And when they are, this means that your plan, your strategic plan, and the strategy that is included in that plan have to go beyond the present. They have to look down the road. They have to be future focused. They certainly need to be able to anticipate changes outside the firm in the economy, market, industry, technology, and that enable the firm to prepare for those changes. And so there is a group of us in strategic management who particularly look at the long term. And they're sometimes called futurists. But, you know, one of the things that I'm very interested in myself is what kind of competitive capabilities will we be dealing with in international markets in the future? What kind of changes in technology will occur that will force us to do our planning differently, and for that matter, do education differently. Then number 4 on Parnell's list, and that is the ability to trade off, you know, alternatives. And that's a very difficult thing to do, but we have a method now for doing that, and it's called contingency planning. And in the very last lecture that I give you in this course, I'm going to talk about how we plan for alternative futures. Today we have the technology with sophisticated computers that we didn't have in the old days to plan for alternative futures, to use models of how our firm's performance potential will change when technology changes, when markets change, when the world politics change, and so forth. And in the old days, you know, it was hard enough to do one plan. Now we have one plan, which is our prevailing plan, but very often we have contingency plans to deal with alternative futures. That's what we're talking about here in number 4. Obviously, to do this well takes talent. And so the last point that Parnell makes is that these decisions typically require a team, a top management team with a lot of different kinds of skills, and often consultants, folks that are brought in to provide their skills. It takes a team to do this work usually. But at the end of the day, the chief executive is the one who has to make the decision regarding the methods of strategic management that is chosen and those big decisions. And after all, that's why he or she gets paid the big bucks, right? Okay, so another point that is made in this chapter, near the end of the chapter, and it's one that you knew already, and that is that the world is getting smaller. You know, and there was a time when the United States and its markets were pretty dominant in the world, and the world responded to the United States. That no longer is the case. China's economy is substantially larger than the economy of the United States. Almost twice as many cars are purchased and produced in China as in the United States. Now, China's got 1.4 billion people. The US has something like 335, 340 million people. That may be too high, 325. In any event, when you take the US economy and divide it by that 330 million people, and China's economy and divide its GDP by 1.4 billion people, then the average, the GDP per capita in China is lower than it is in the United States. So from a standards of living perspective, we're still a lot more fortunate to be living in this country. But the standards of living, GDP per capita, are rising rapidly in China, and it has become a very large consumer market. So if you're going to be a large consumer products company and you just neglect China, you're not a world player any longer. You might have been in the old days, but you won't be anymore. India is almost as big in population as in China. It doesn't have nearly the GDP per capita as China or the US. But after the 2050, as we move into the second half of this century, there will come a time when India will be just as important as China, and so forth. So the world is in a state of change, and that change is happening faster rather than more slowly. And so we've got to be able to understand and at least imagine what those changes will be, and then plan accordingly. And if a company or a country has competitive advantage, if it's able to respond to or create markets and industries more effectively than other companies or countries than in countries, then that firm or that country has what's called comparative advantage. And so Parnell points out it's the idea that some products may be produced more cheaply or in better quality in particular countries than others. That's different than competitive advantage. Competitive advantage just takes a look at one industry and says, okay, with regard to the accumulation of resources and capabilities to use resources, what combination, what business model is most effective in this industry where we find ourselves? And the firm that comes up with the best collection of resources and skills to use those resources will have competitive advantage. But comparative advantage is the difference between corporations and firms in global markets that have benefits simply due to where they are and what resources are located where they are. That's comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is all about location. Competitive advantage is all about resources and capabilities. You may notice that when I say resources and capabilities, I sort of mumble. That's because they're the same thing. A capability is a resource, isn't it? Okay. Collections of skills all together make up bundles of capabilities. And those capabilities are intertwined with physical and intellectual and technological resources. And so all together, they're capabilities. And those capabilities, when they're structured one way, form different resources than when you take the same pieces and put them together in a different bundle. You get a different resource. And that's why firms with the same, what look like the same resources can be very different because of the way they've assembled their resources. Okay, this is the final slide. And it demonstrates something that John Parnell has done that you really ought to thank him for. If you're in my course, you and your teammates have been assigned a company to study. And throughout the course, you're going to be gathering information about that company so that you can do a strategic assessment of it. And at the end of the course, present that assessment. And that'll be a big, long presentation. And essentially, in that presentation, you will apply all of the strategic management principles that you should have acquired during this entire course. At the end of every chapter, Parnell gives you a to-do list, things to do based on what's in the chapter, so that you can build this material, this case analysis, as you work your way through the course. So here's the to-do list after chapter 1, and there will be one at the end of every chapter. That was a really great touch for him. First, he says, when did the corporation form? And I would ask you to go a little further, but try to summarize the big turning points. what has made this company what it is today? What were the main turning points on its road from its inception to the corporation that it is today? And when you think about it, when you do a little bit of reading and research, you'll find out that in each one of these companies, there have been major turning points, and they have had great strategic significance. The contingency view of competitive advantage, right? The contingency view of strategic management. When those changes occurred, so did management's approach to strategic management. So did its strategic challenges. The company will be public. In our course, we choose only public companies, so there's plenty of information that those companies are required to submit to the government. You can get and make use of. What's the mission? We talked about mission as the economic function that a firm undertakes to perform for society. In lecture 1, I talked about Abel's model. What community of customers? What community? What segment of society or market is the company attempting to serve? 2, what are the unmet needs that this company is trying to satisfy? And 3, where does it find competitive advantage, or must it find competitive advantage to do so? And finally, what's the business model? And here we're talking about just very broadly, how is that system of inputs to outputs structured? It's sort of an organization chart, but it's a functional organization chart rather than a people organization chart. So if you can if you can take this as your to-do list, your team can get started, and that will enable you to make some significant progress in your project. And with that, I think what I should do first of all is turn off the slides, and second, to let you know that this review is now finally over, and the best thing that I can do is let you get back to work in either taking the quiz for this chapter or getting together with your teammates and going over that to-do list. So with that in mind, I am going to have to try to figure out how to stop this thing from recording.